Good evening and welcome to our event this evening. Is religious liberty under threat in America? That's the question that tonight's panel discussion, which is co-sponsored by the Church in the 21st Century Center, the Boston College Law School, and the School of Theology and Ministry. But that is the question we've asked our panel to address this evening. My name is Eric Goldschmidt. I'm the director of the Church in the 21st Century Center, which has been a catalyst and resource for the renewal of the Catholic Church in the United States, serving Boston College and the greater Catholic community. C21 Center provides opportunities for conversation on difficult issues for the Church. That is, topics that are complicated, potentially divisive, and have serious implications for the Catholic community. To address this important question on religious liberty, we have three very distinguished panelists. On the far end, Vincent Rougeot, Dean of the Boston College Law School. Dr. Kathleen Keaveney, the John P. Murphy Foundation Professor of Law and Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. And Father Brian Hare, the Parker Gilbert Montgomery Professor of the Practice of Religion and Public Life at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Father Hare also serves as the Secretary for Health and Social Services for the Archdiocese of Boston. To moderate this evening's discussion, we are honored to have John Allen, Senior Correspondent of the National Catholic Reporter. In your program is also a little more about their backgrounds and their biographies. Welcome to our panelists, to John, our moderator. Thank you for being here. John will lead the discussion for about an hour, and then we'll address selected questions that many of you submitted on your way in this evening. So without further delay, let us begin our discussion.
So I take it you're all saying that war is the wrong piece of imagery to use to describe the present situation, but I'm sure you all would concede there clearly is a debate in the United States about religious freedom and the proper freedoms that belong to religious institutions versus the demands of life in a secular, pluralistic society. So maybe rather than talking about metaphors, it would be more helpful to go directly to specific cases. So let's talk about the most obvious specific case that we have before us, which is the sort of point of departure for the current standoff between the Catholic bishops of the United States and the White House, which is the HHS mandates controversy. The Department of Health and Human Services has proposed a set of regulations for the implementation of healthcare reform that, in effect, would require private insurance providers, including the majority of religious institutions in the country, to cover services that Catholics, and not just Catholics, but other religious institutions would regard as inherently immoral, specifically contraception, sterilization, and some drugs that the Church regards as abortion-inducing. Can I ask each of the three of you to just tell us, what do you make of the controversy over the HHS mandates? And do you think that illustrates a growing encroachment on religious freedom in America?
Well, my definition of it would be that it is a serious, the legislation as it exists is a serious incursion on the life of institutions related to a major religion in the country. That incursion, I think, is unnecessary, and the way to deal with it is fairly straightforward, at least as I understand both the origin of the problem, its content, and its possible resolution. The origin of the problem does lie in the Affordable Care Act, the Health Care Act of 2010, which I thought was an act that should be supported and still think it should be supported. I do not think the problem we face today was inevitable in light of the passage of that act, so I would begin with that. The second step in the evolution of the problem was that the act ordered a series of mandates, an individual mandate that everyone must buy health insurance, a mandate that employers must provide health insurance or pay a penalty, And then thirdly, the third step, and this is where it started to get into complexity, the third step was that part of the Health Care Act called for provisions, if you will, of preventive care. That in itself is not all that complicated. There are a number of provisions that are do not cause any problem. Once you moved into reproductive care, it was likely that there would be debate in the country about that question. So when that came on the table, people should have been careful in the formulation of policy. Still, that is manageable in a pluralistic society. The next step was the problem, it seems to me, and that was that when you moved to what religiously related institutions had to do in their health care insurance, then I think, to my mind, the simple, straightforward solution to that problem is an appropriate exemption. Because we're a democratic society, policy will be decided by majority vote in most instances. Because we're a religiously pluralistic society, policies that are decided by majority vote can run counter to deeply held religious views. The way you solve that problem is that you allow the law to remain in place and you provide an exemption for religiously based institutions that have difficulty with parts of the law. I think the failure was a failure to provide an adequate exemption. I think the problem is the threat to large-scale religious institutions, particularly in the Catholic Church, because we're the largest social service provider and educational provider. So, to my mind, it's bad policy that tries to exclude an exemption, and in my mind, it's bad policy not to describe the problem precisely, which is a threat to religious institutions as they conduct their business because they're not granted an appropriate exemption.
Kathy?
Yeah, I mean, what Brian says, Father Hare says, is extremely important. I think there's another piece of the puzzle that we need to put on the table. The other piece of the puzzle is we as a nation are trying to come up with, for the first time, a basic set of benefits, a basic benefit package that is going to be available to everybody, that should be accessible to everybody, and you could argue shouldn't depend upon, what you do for a living, how much you make, or where you work. That would be the ideal. And we are in the middle of trying to figure out what should go into that benefit package. Now, in this country, the division on contraception is pretty complicated. Most people consider it a settled moral issue that contraception is not always an immoral act, that it is something that, that can be used legitimately by people in order to plan their families. Many Catholics believe that way too, following the majority report after or before Humanae Vitae was issued. But at the same time, it's very clear that the magisterium of the Catholic Church, the authoritative magisterium, says, no, we do not think that is right. We think contraception is immoral. What I would like to see us be able to talk about, really, is the tension between the two sets of rights. Why would you want to have contraception in a benefit package if you didn't think it was immoral? Well, one reason is that, at least according to the Institute of Medicine, it actually, having women plan their pregnancies results in healthier pregnancies and arguably results in a reduction in abortion. So now that's not going to get you where you need to get if you think contraception is immoral, because if you're a Catholic, because our church teaches the end does not justify the means. But if you don't think it's immoral, there are good reasons there. So part of what you need to do is to try to put yourself, I think, in a pluralistic society, in the position of everybody that has an interest in this, not just the people who are claiming the religious exemption, but the people who want the basic benefit package. I have a little bit of hope. I've just looked at the new sets of, proposed regulations that we may be going toward a workable compromise. The Federal Register has a new set of descriptions of what they're going to do in the compromise, and what that's going to do is say every woman who's going to be able to get her contraception, we're going to make the insurance companies cover it. We're not going to make the Catholic entities refer for it, pay for it, or even tell people how to get it. And they've even got a plan, whether this will actually work, to cover self-insured health care plans. And I think what we should do is say, is this something we can all live with? Looking at the interests on both sides, not simply look at one set of interests or the other interests, but we all have an interest in living together. Can we live with this as a compromise in a pragmatic way?
Well, I would just add briefly, what strikes me about this problem is we have this remarkable situation in this country where something that is incredibly important and incredibly basic to a healthy community, healthcare, depends heavily on its provision from religious institutions. I mean, the Catholic Church has done something remarkable for this country in creating a system of hospitals and other types of social services for the American people. One of the reasons that was done is because we have such a hostility to the state in some instances where it might be more productive to have the state provide certain benefits or communities to find other means for providing benefits. We have relied on charitable organizations and religious organizations to do it. Now then, we have put these religious organizations in a very awkward position because the community is heavily dependent on these organizations to provide health care. These organizations are rooted in certain religious values. The state has now created a mandate that would force them to pay for insurance coverage for things that they find anathema. But the issue missing here is that's one reason why perhaps it would have been good to have a better discussion about a different way of providing these benefits through the state itself. If indeed that had been the case, then these organizations would not be put into the position of having to pay for things that they would rather not pay for, that they believe are wrong. But we weren't allowed to really have a vibrant conversation about a single-payer system or whatever you want to call it, which has been the view in most other liberal democratic societies, that's an appropriate role for the state, particularly in a lot of societies that come to the liberal democratic tradition from Catholicism. If you speak to people in continental Europe about healthcare, they often see it as a right. Typically, the people in Catholic societies are societies with strong Catholic traditions. That's how they see it. How could you possibly not see the state providing that? But we couldn't do that here. And that's part of our pluralism. That's the society we are. But that's put us partially into this particular dilemma. And beyond that, I think we need to think a little bit more carefully about what it means in this society that we are, I'm sorry, let me just to close. The other issue that I think is raised by this is this a threat to religious liberty? And in some ways I think you could argue that yes. I mean, this is the camel's nose under the tent kind of argument where you see the state creeping into religion via these organizations. And I don't think it's unreasonable to think that if you look at other societies where the church has been involved in these types of activities, there has been, in many cases, an aggressive entrance of the state into internal activities of faith organization or faith-based organizations. So, I mean, to say that there's a threat isn't to be alarmist necessarily, because if you look at the trajectory from other societies, that could happen. But at the same time, to not think carefully about why we're in the place we're in, and to not be involved in a more dynamic conversation about other ways to do this has also put us there. So I think we need to be a little bit more thoughtful when these issues come up about what the consequences are of sort of joining in on the bandwagon of saying, well, the market should provide this and insurance companies should provide this, without thinking carefully about who the actual providers are and what that might mean for their integrity.
I would be happy to be where Kathy is if they can work out an agreement. I am not optimistic they're going to work out an agreement. That's my best judgment, my best empirical judgment. So I would obviously try to find the common ground if it can be shaped, and it's a question, to some degree, it's a question of legal and policy analysis. My own point, though, is if you can't find it, this is not an insoluble problem. And the way you solve it, I think, is the way we have solved other questions in American law and policy. So that the point about the right to health care is the starting, or the dignity of the person, the right to health care, then the package of benefits that goes with it. And as I said, I think that question will be decided by majority vote, unless now the courts are another package right now. But it'll be decided by majority vote. And on either side of the argument, to fight this out over contraception is not going to make it. On either side. Clearly, you're right about the public opinion of the country on contraception. So that's not where the issue lies, to my mind. It is in extremis. If you can't agree, I think you can exempt institutions. I personally felt that the Blunt Amendment was the wrong piece of legislation to support, because the Blunt Amendment aims not just at institutions, it aims at every individual employer in the country.
And Brian, I'm sorry.
I think that goes too far. So my own view is that you try to go for the common ground. If you can't get the common ground, is this an insoluble question that leads to the most extreme consequences? I would hope not. And my point is, you can keep the majority vote that supports the law, if it is a majority vote, and then allow for an exemption.
And Brian, very quickly, for those who haven't followed the vicissitudes of this debate, can you just explain, you mentioned the Blunt Amendment. Can you just very briefly explain what that was?
I don't want to claim I'm exegeting this in its fullness. It was an amendment sponsored by Senator Blunt from Missouri. They tried to attach, in the House, I'm sorry, Representative. No, it was in the Senate.
I think it was
The
in
Blunt
Senate,
Amendment
yeah.
was in the Senate.
Yes.
It was defeated in the
Senate.
Senate. No, they tried to attach it to the transportation bill as an amendment. And the effect of the Blunt Amendment would be to negate the problem that was at the heart of the debate about religious institutions having to provide services that contradict their moral and religious foundations. But it also included that not simply religious institutions, it also said that any employer who has a religious or moral objection to a provision should be protected in allowing to take that out of the health plan. I think that that goes too far.
Okay.
But it doesn't go too far, it seems to me, to recognize, basically, one of the characteristics that's behind this debate is the way we do social policy in the United States. If you look at the advanced industrial democracies, 18 countries in the world, and look at how social policy is done, I think it's fair to say that the American model, as opposed to most of the other European countries and Japan, the American model relies less on the state, more on the market, and a lot on nonprofits. We have a version of the welfare state, but it's much more limited than Europe or Japan. We always rely on the market, for good or ill, to accomplish many things. Think of the welfare reform debate, get people into the market. Think of the healthcare debate, you have to rely on the market. Now, you can debate that proposition, but that's what we do. But there's a gap where you require less of the state and more of the market. There's a gap that doesn't get met, and a lot of people fall through that gap. And that's where nonprofits come in the United States. And so when you look at the nonprofit world, the religious world is a major part of it. And if you look at the religious world, the Catholic world is by far the largest player in this arena. So my point is really that exemption makes for good social policy And I hate to see it, I hate to lose that vision.
I guess what worries me about this, I mean, I certainly see the point of this, but part of the trouble is we're in an extremely pluralistic country, and different people have different religious traditions. And how do we give due weight not only to our own religious tradition and the Catholic tradition, but also to other people's very different perceptions, perhaps, of what their moral obligations are? We think about religious liberty, and it's a multifaceted thing, right? I mean, you've got states, some states established religion. You can do some things as a state-established religion, the Puritans knew this, that you couldn't accomplish. You can live a whole life that way. We Catholics, we Americans said, no, we don't want to do that. That unity isn't worth the price in repressing the religious freedom of smaller groups within that and of individuals whose views differ from that of the majority. I think part of what we're dealing with here is the tension between institutional religious freedom and individual religious freedom. And because you do have people who many times don't have a choice about where they get a job. It's not totally analogous to people not having a choice about what country they live in, but the First Amendment cases actually take this into account. You know, there are some things that ought not to depend upon where you work as to be part of the basic benefit package. And our rules on religious liberty have to look at kind of everyone's needs and perspective. Suppose there was a religious employer that had, you know, that belonged to the Church of Zero Population Growth and didn't want to cover pregnancy services. You know, that was their deep religious, but should they be able to say, we're not going to cover pregnancy services? So, of course not, but how do we approach these questions fairly without putting the thumb on the scale of our own beliefs, so that we're treating other people in a pluralistic society respectfully?
I think an exemption is not Catholic specific. An exemption is a method by which you adjudicate religious pluralism. So you're right, there are multiple religious traditions in the country, and part of the genius of religious pluralism is trying to accommodate more than one. So, I mean, I feel for sure, looking at the social service world, one of the things that's ahead of us in this country is going to be accommodating Islam and Islamic social service agencies. And they are different than Catholic, and they are different than Protestant, and they're different than Jewish. But we're going to have to accommodate.
And Brian, is your test for a religious exemption primarily demographic? That is, the reason that we're going to have to accommodate Islam is that there's an increasing number of Muslims in America. The reason I ask this question is that in the abstract, I think all of us could agree that religious activity, quote unquote, merits some kind of constitutional protection in the United States. We, after all, do have the First Amendment that guarantees it. The hard part is deciding what constitutes religious activity, right? And which religious groups deserve that kind of protection. So if I can ask each of the three of you to weigh in on this, how would you establish the criteria for deciding which religious groups and which religious activity deserve the kind of exemption you're talking about versus Kathy's hypothetical example of the Church of Zero Population Growth that I think all of us would agree at a threshold level probably doesn't?
Well, I think we've had to do that before. It seems to me I think the presumption is on the side of liberty, and the presumption is you take people at their word, but there are tests. Not everybody that says they're a religious group qualifies for tax exemption. We make decisions on that question. I'd start with a broad-based view of religion because we're pluralistic. We've got over 1,000 denominations in the country. But I wouldn't say that just anybody that says they're religious or that they're a religious institution passes the test. I'm not positive I can tell you what substantive criteria I'd use right away. You want to be careful.
So you're taking the Oliver Wendell Holmes view, that you know a religion when you see it.
I'm not positive I'd adopt that proposition either. So, but I mean, I think this is not a new problem.
Right,
I mean,
for sure.
IRS codes have to decide this question all the time.
Well, I think this is a critical problem of liberal democratic theory that we need to think more carefully about in this country, because really, to be perfectly honest, I think our laws and our understanding under the Constitution of religious freedom is somewhat incoherent. Because we do face this problem, we have ways to deal with it, but it's an expanding set.
Yeah,
I mean,
no
if
question.
we set out criteria of what is a religion, those criteria aren't necessarily that difficult to meet. So there has to be some understanding of, what are the core values that we're trying to promote here. So I would say that, I mean, inasmuch as there are some, one core value that seems to be common is this idea that we should have, the state should have equal regard for all religions. The state should not prefer any religion over another religion, and the state should not harm or suppress any particular religion. The state should try to create rough equality amongst religions, which is not always easy to do, but at least it's an organizing principle that makes some sense. Now, our model under American law is very complicated and convoluted. There are other models, and when you look at those models and compare them to ours, you see what our problem is. So you could use the French model of liberal democracy, which says the secular space of the state is supreme. So public order is secular, religions are subordinate to the state defines what a religion is, and the state determines what religions can do. Now that's not our tradition, but I just want to say that it's one within many in democratic pluralism.
Of course, you're talking about pre-Sarkozy France, huh?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, people understand, and I'm also saying, and if I were a Muslim in France, I might say, well, you say that, but frankly, the negotiation about what secularism is in France was really a negotiation amongst Catholics and secular Catholics, and Catholicism is somewhat preferred or benefited under French secularism, and other religions actually don't get the same kind of goodies that Catholicism gets. But that's a different conversation. At least the theory is that the state is secular. Or you could have an established church like they do in Britain. I mean, the theoretical truth in Britain is, well, we have a church, the Church of England. The Church of England is preferred. Other religions are given basic equality, basic democratic rights and everything, but at the end of the day, the Church of England gets special privileges that other religions don't get. And to some degree, religion is defined based on an understanding of the Church of England as the established church, so too in Scandinavia and other places. Our situation is very different. We have a tradition of saying that we're supposed to be a place where there is no established church, but there is freedom of religion.
Right.
So that means theoretically that everyone has a place at the table, and that's initially how the country was founded, although to be perfectly honest, the country was really founded on a Protestant establishment. We did have an established religion. It was sort of broad-based Protestantism. First establishment, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, etc. And as that set grew, it really wasn't until the middle of the 20th century that Catholics and Jews really had a place at this religion table. So to say that we have this wonderful tradition of robust religious freedom is a little Pollyanna-ish. It took a lot of hard work and people suffered a lot of discrimination in the United States to get to a place where there was a general understanding that all religions should be treated equally.
And arguably, we're not even there. I mean, I think Vince is actually right about, kind of the privileging of a certain kind of Protestantism, even in the religion clauses. If you look at Wisconsin v. Yoder, for example, which was a case about whether the Amish could take their kids out of school after elementary school, you'll see Douglas talking about religion is the freedom of the individual. He didn't win in this one, but there are other cases where this came. It's a religious belief, it's the freedom of the individual. It's not a corporatist understanding in the way that, say, Catholics and other traditions would have it. But I think actually the line that we're facing isn't just what is freedom of religion, it's the line between religion and action. Nobody is denying, freedom of religious belief. You can sit at home and think whatever you want. You can make yourself your own God and your own pope, and nobody's going to stop you. But the question comes when you act on those beliefs and how those actions impinge others. Religious freedom has never been understood to be an absolute right. It's always been tempered by both the need to respect other people and the need for public order. And if you read Dignitatis Humanae, the Vatican Declaration on Religious Liberty, you'll see this. Now, where we tend to end up in arguments in the United States is over what is necessary for public order. And if you want to talk to somebody about that, talk to some of the Mormons. Mormons, if you know anything about Mormonism, do believe, or did believe for a while, that plural marriage was a requirement of their religious tradition. We ruthlessly, the federal government ruthlessly suppressed this in Utah and in other places. Arguably we provoked the change in their revelation, which finally came just in time to stop the whole thing from being shut down. So, and what we said at the time was, well, that's about morality. That's about morality. That's not about religion. You can believe whatever you want. Well, actually, we didn't even let them do that, but you can't marry more than one person. Well, then what we're talking about in the Catholic framework really is 3 or 4 very hot-button issues: contraception, abortion to some degree, and gay marriage. How we're really talking about what our public morality is and who gets to participate in that. And if you don't have the same, if you move into a minority position on a kind of a question of public morality, which it may be that Christians are doing, or some branch of Christians are doing, what kind of rights of participation do you have in the society despite that fact? So it's not just freedom of religion, it's about
Right.
freedom of action and freedom to participate in the definition of the public morality.
But it is also about freedom of institutions. It is not just about freedom of individuals. It is
both.
also,
Both, yeah.
religious communities have the right to establish institutions to carry out their ministry in society. They have to obey basic laws. In the expansion of the Charitable Choice Act, some of the religious communities felt that auditing requirements by the government were an infringement on their social service agencies. I think you want a criterion, that's a good criterion. If you're going to set up social service agencies and take government funding, you're going to let the government auditors in.
Very American criteria. Audits are okay.
If you don't want to do that, as the Mennonites don't, you don't take any government money at all, and then you run your institution according to the full-scale range. But, I mean, it is freedom of the person, the right to religious liberty, but it is the right to religious liberty and the right to religious communities, and religious communities are not simply about worship and doctrine.
I
So
agree, but it's both.
So,
Yeah,
well, that
I
actually
think
provides a
it is.
bridge to the next question. First of all, Kathy, I'm quite sure the Mitt Romney campaign thanks you for that defense of the Mormon tradition. But more broadly, here's the question. The bishops in their diagnosis of the situation in the United States have suggested that there are 2 principal threats to religious liberty afoot. One is that religious liberty is being defined increasingly as freedom of worship as opposed to freedom of corporate action. The other is that religious freedom is being redefined as a right that belongs exclusively to individuals as opposed to institutions. Can I ask each of the 3 of you, do you agree with that diagnosis? I mean, do you think those are real dangers in terms of trends in American politics, American law? And if so, what do we do about it?
For myself, I don't think most people in this country, and I don't think most public agencies or the state think that religious freedom is limited to freedom of worship. No. I mean, the Soviets used to say that. The Soviets used to say we have freedom of religion because the churches are open. Right. I don't think that that's the dominant impression in the courts. I don't think it's the dominant impression in the state, federal or state. I don't think that's the case. I personally rely on John Courtney Murray's commentary on the right to religious freedom in the 1965 article in Theological Studies, where he said, among religious freedom, you have to count the right of the community to establish multiple institutions, including schools, to fulfill your ministry. We have a constitutional tradition in this country that says you can establish schools, but you're not going to get any money. That's a reasonable decision, it seems to me. It's decided differently in other countries. I think when you get into social service and healthcare, increasingly it's true that there are more and more conflicted issues, and I think it is wise to maintain a freedom of scope of action for religiously based institutions to remain committed to their religious tradition and to serve the wider society. Our religious institutions do not serve Catholics. That's not what we do. And therefore, the idea, again, it goes back to bad policy. I think it's bad policy to undercut a collaborative policy of church, state, religious institutions, and the government working together. To do that, I think sometimes you have to provide an exemption because the majority rule will run against the religious tradition.
And I agree that that can happen. I mean, let me back up for a second. I think the constitutional law is a bit iffy on this. As I said, one of the defects in the American constitutional tradition for a long time was that religious freedom was construed, centrally as freedom of the individual in the more Protestant model. The case that decisively undermined this was Wisconsin v. Yoder, where we said, well, the Amish have a right to educate their children and to contribute to the community. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, depending upon your perspective, Wisconsin v. Yoder wasn't the last word on this. There was Employment Division versus Smith, where it's a general rule. You can get into the weeds of First Amendment law on this, but basically said a generally applicable law that's not specifically targeted at a religious group is applicable, even if it, incidentally burdens a religious group's freedom of worship or anything else. So, for example, you could have a law in Oregon that said, no drugs, and the fact that it interfered with the Native Americans' use of peyote as part of their sacramental ritual, that did not violate the Constitution. It may have violated other values, but it didn't violate the Constitution. So we go back and forth on some of this. The problem, though, I keep thinking we've got to protect the religious institutions, but I keep thinking as well of the people who are affected by them, who may not agree with the religious institution's views, but who have no choice but to work with that religious institution. What do we owe? I think religious institutions have to ask themselves, not what do I need just to protect my rights, but what do I owe to other people who disagree with me on this issue or on other issues? And if we were having that conversation, just a basic golden rule conversation, where I said, what do I owe you? Not just what do you owe me, I'd be much happier. I mean, we don't let religious institutions get federal funding if they discriminate on the basis of race, for example. It doesn't matter if the view is based in their religion, we don't allow it. So how do we decide what are basic norms that everybody has to abide by as part of our society versus ones we are going to allow difference on? Would I allow a religious institution, would you allow a religious institution to say, well, if two people come to the emergency room at the same time they're in an accident, we're always going to treat the man first because men are more important than women? I'm not inclined to give government money to an institution like that. Now, the trouble is, how do you distinguish that in principle from the kinds of things we're dealing with here? Is it possible, say, on,
Well, the first thing I'd say is Oregon versus Smith is one more reason for me to disagree with Justice Scalia. So, I mean, the fact of the matter is that was not regarded, I think, as a high point of American constitutional jurisprudence.
I agree.
So Oregon versus Smith is not a good case to go very far with, I think. The idea with Oregon versus Smith is to hope somebody overrides it soon. The Congress tried. And so on that one, I would not want to go down that road. My own sense is you're right. You have to try to protect the dignity and the rights of everyone. I think religious communities very often are not going to be able to do that on everything that the American public decides is necessary and good. I think because a religious community disagrees doesn't mean the American public should change its mind. On the other hand, I'm not positive it's a good idea to then say the religious community is out of business. Now, you can. The government funding, it seems to me, is an add-on. I mean, the question of whether you take government money or not is, in the first instance, a decision should be made by the religious community. And some don't. And if you do take it, you're going to be in a constant battle. You're going to be, and you might as well accept that. But the battle is the line drawing. I don't think we disagree on that. It's a line drawing case, and the question is, how do you decide what substantive lines you'll draw?
Well, and then I think that that's the question. On the part of the government, what lines are fair to impose, you know, I mean, as a condition
I
of
don't
government?
think this is, but I don't think this is a matter of government funding. There are cases that are government funding, but
Right.
the insurance question
No,
is different than government
no,
funding.
but
That's the point. It's
government
more
funding
pervasive. So, I mean, the government funding rule, I don't, one of the statements of the bishops said that it would be unconstitutional if the government set conditions ahead of time that conflicted with the religious tradition. I'm not sure that's right. I don't know that the government has to design its policies in light of religious tradition. The point is, once it's defined its policies and opened up room for collaboration, then the question is, how do you make the choices?
Vincent, did you want to jump in on this?
Well, I was just going to jump in and say, I mean, another problem that this demonstrates, I think, is, you know, the heavy reliance we increasingly have on the courts to deal with these issues.
Right.
If we had a robust democratic conversation, the appropriate place for that is in the legislature.
Right.
The legislature should be the place where there is a broad representative group of opinions, where people from the different traditions come together under a structure of a democratic, liberal democratic environment that reflects the pluralism of the society, and where some of these things can be hashed out politically and these compromises are going to be made. I mean, clearly, in a pluralistic society, there will be compromises. So that's one point. The second point that Father Hare makes, I think, is really important too, is that if you are going to be a religious organization or religious institution and function and take government money, then you are going to be part of that give and take in the conversation. So one of the other questions that's looming here is, what is the relationship between religious institutions and the state?
Right.
How do you negotiate that relationship? And again, I go back to my earlier point. Different democratic societies have negotiated in different ways, but we really, I don't think, have come to a good understanding in this country. And now I'll just refer back to Kathy's point. You know, our constitutional and legal traditions do not deal well with groups.
Right.
Or with collectivities. Our tradition in the United States is heavily focused on the individual, always has been. Individual conscience, individual rights, individual freedom, liberty, 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 in an individual sense. I mean, why do we see, I mean, we see the kind of political dynamic that creates really across the spectrum, be it on social issues or economic issues, this individualistic view that does not comport very well with religious traditions that see the collective as very important, that talk about the common good, that see community as essential to the wholeness of an individual. So we're always bumping up against, I think increasingly, particularly from the perspective of Catholic institutions, which have had a tradition of having much more connected relationships to the states of which they had been traditionally a part. The American environment is kind of weird for Catholics. I mean, it's not an environment that traditionally worked for the Catholic model. And so now we're starting to work out some of those problems now that we, you know, Catholics, particularly since we run so many institutions, are much, you know, more important part of the conversation.